You guys have heard the phrase, when all else fails, they take you to war. And why is that a phrase? War seems like it's inflationary because you're spending money on non productive things. War seems unpopular. So, why would politicians do this? Well, when it comes down to the blame game, meaning people start getting mad, civil unrest starts happening, maybe because inflation, you can't afford food, they have to start paying off their college loans again, whatever it is, and the population starts getting angry, and Washington becomes the person they want to blame. Washington's got to find somebody else to unify Americans as the problem, as the enemy. And you guys have heard a lot of talk about China and war with China. I'm not saying China's great. CCP stands for Chinese Communist Party. But a lot of Washington is talking like war with China is inevitable. And I think to myself, okay, so why would war with China be inevitable? They invade Taiwan. Okay. So does the cost of American blood and treasure to defend Taiwan equal the benefit we get? Right? So we're all over the world defending democracy, all over the world, right? So Taiwan is a strategic partner, and we have alliances with them. So I get that to some degree, but it's this assumption that we will go to war that has me scratching my head, because I don't think China wants war. Who wants war here? So my question is, if this is what doesn't make sense to me. So you got all these politicians, this Western media talking about war with China. It's becoming a hot topic of conversation. War is logistics. War is logistics. Okay. If you can't resupply your troops, if you can't resupply manufacturing in America, you're screwed. Why is all of our supply chain, including prescription drugs? Imagine if prescription drugs were just shut off in America. We're the most medicated population in the world. SSRIs through the roof, depression, yada, yada. And China just goes, hey, we're not manufacturing that anymore. Sorry. And we're talking about war with them. That's what doesn't make sense to me, because we have this Achilles heel, which is a lot of the things we get and rely on come from China, yet we're talking tough about China. Doesn't make any sense to me. And one of the things that stood out, I read this tweet the other day, because a lot of people talk tough. They're talking tough about Russia, talking tough about Ukraine, yada, yada, yada. War, you've heard this phrase too, is hell. A lot of people haven't experienced it, and it is, right? To some extent, you're like, what do we even gain from this? A lot of American service members are thinking that right now. I've talked at length about the recruiting problem. But people who virtue signal online, I like this tweet from Jason Lowry. I'll show you. He says, PSA, if your military falls behind, that means you get drafted. That's right. So the recruiting problems that we're seeing, sorry, I'm getting a call. These recruiting problems that we're seeing, and people are like, hey, I really like what the military is doing with this new diversity, equity, and inclusion that is causing people, regardless of your opinion, it is causing Americans not to join the military. And they like it, and they're doubling down on it. You know what happens when your military falls apart? You get drafted. That's right. Yes. Not ideal. Okay, so he says you get drafted. Hoping for the demise of your own military means that you have to defend yourself and your country instead of continuing to enjoy that armchair from which you criticize it. If your military falters, you become the military. I couldn't have said it better myself. And so this idea that we could take on in the military what we call a near peer, somebody who has very similar capabilities to us, because a lot of the wars that we fought in the last 20 years, we were fighting third rate, fourth rate, fifth rate, whatever you want to call them. They didn't even have a military. There's guys in man jammies shooting at us with AK-47s and RPGs. But it wasn't a near peer, somebody with air power and a Navy power, which would be a totally different cost benefit analysis. A lot of Americans aren't making that cost benefit analysis. So if we do go to war with China, that seems to be inevitable in Washington. Hey, China's a rising power. I think it all has to do with the dollar. And as I've said many times, you don't you don't have to fire a shot, which China knows this very well. Outcompete them. Outcompete them. If businesses want to go to China because of their labor costs, which is happening a lot in America, as we well know, it's because the dollar is so strong and we have the world reserve currency. Not being the world reserve currency might actually be a benefit in onshore manufacturing. It would be inflationary in the short term, but in the long term, I think it would be good for America. But what instead of outcompeting them, being a beacon of hope for people who want to come start businesses, have economic freedom, and letting the entrepreneurial spirit of the American people run wild, we have regulation after regulation. We're trying to shoot ourselves in the foot with green energy, which is more cost, less dense. We all know this, regardless of your opinion of it. Meanwhile, China's burning fossil fuels like there's no tomorrow. And we are taxing our citizens to death, all because certain people, banks, high-level politicians, the in group, it's one big club and you ain't in it, want to get more rich, right? Because they benefit from this. So there's certain people that benefit, and they would send you to war to keep it going. Because if China wants to de-dollarize, Russia wants to de-dollarize, that is a reason, because that decimates their power here in the United States. Because we have benefited from it as well as citizens, but we export our inflation because the world needs dollars. And the demand for US treasuries, which is our debt, has been very high around the world because we have the world reserve currency. And that demand is going down, which would be reason enough for Washington to go to war. Is that reason enough for you? Not me. Just to maintain this economic hegemony that is made up in Fugazi that helps us and hurts a lot of people around the world. It's not to outcompete them, which we can. The American people in a free market will always outcompete a totalitarian government. I always link back to Nuremberg, or not Nuremberg, sorry, Chernobyl, right? Why did that happen? If you've seen the show, if you've read the history, that meltdown happened. There was a lot of people that noticed they were doing it wrong, this nuclear power facility. But they didn't want to say anything because the USSR was totalitarian. And if they said something that was against the regime, they could be killed. That same thing happens in Russia, folks. Or sorry, in China, and in Russia probably too. That same thing happens in China. So how much of an entrepreneurial spirit do you think people have? If they go against the CCP, they might get killed. So they don't want to do that. They don't want to go out on a limb and invent something that's freedom-based. They don't want to do that. We can do that here in America. But we have politicians and ESG stuff that's just trying to do China light, right? We're going to outcompete them by trying what they're doing. Doesn't make any sense. So this other article talks about if we go to war with China, the U.S. military will need conscription to fight China. You know what that means? That means you get drafted. It's not even if we make recruiting numbers, because the recruiting numbers we have can't fight a near peer, can't fight a government, because there's going to be massive losses. A government that has similar capabilities to the United States. It says here in the article, the United States will thus need a radically transform its force structure to better contend with emerging threat environments, up to and including reinstating conscription, says Jonathan Askenas, an assistant professor of politics at Catholic University of America. This is a five-alarm fire, Askenas said during April 11th discussion with the Hudson Institute think tank. We're facing global threats. We have a force structure which we know will not work against those threats, meaning we don't have enough people in the military. We basically can't fight a war larger than Iraq with an all-volunteer force, he said. And I agree with him on that. So anybody who's posturing and saying, hey, we fight for democracy, you fight for democracy because you're going to get drafted. So if you're pro-war, another phrase, war is hell, and it is. Anybody who's experienced it knows. A lot of times you leave thinking we accomplished nothing. except for spilling blood and treasure. But you're going to get drafted. So people who vote for it, people who like the posturing, people who like poking the bear around the world, if we fight a near peer, you're probably going to get drafted. Unfortunately, Askin says the all-volunteer force was proving incapable of generating the numbers of service members required for a war between great powers. By the way, I said why. That happened in the last 2 years. Something changed. And his burdensome logistical process were likely to be ineffective in either a conflict with China or in the Indo-Pacific theater or supporting European powers against Russia. Supporting European powers against Russia. As they buy oil from China that China's getting from Russia. Remember the story I did about Macron. Askina says we have to be ruthless. We need to adapt our force structure, not to hypothetical threats or in some universal Swiss Army knife approach, but to the actual threats we face. And what are those? Transphobia. That's what the military is focused on. White supremacy. There's a reason people aren't joining the military. And regardless of if you agree with that reason, they have the freedom not to join because it's an all-volunteer force. And this posturing around the world and this kind of inevitable, we're going to war with China. We don't know, citizens don't know what they're signing up for when they say that. War needs to be avoided at all costs. And the enemy always gets a vote, as I've always said. So obviously there's lines in the sand where you're like, hey, if you cross this, bad things are going to happen. But if China is on the aggressive front, which it seems, by the way, they're unifying economically with BRICS nations, not through war, but through joint interests. So methinks that they wouldn't want to, while they're doing this and winning a war economically without shooting a shot, they wouldn't want to jeopardize that by going to war. So again, I ask you, who wants it? Yes, China is definitely saber rattling around Taiwan. But the American people need to understand that everything comes with a cost benefit. So is it worth, and this is up to you, is it worth the cost of American blood and treasure to defend democracy around the world when your own nation is imploding in on itself economically? Maybe it is. Maybe it isn't. But the thing is, you won't get the choice. Because if we go to war, you'll probably get drafted. My humble opinion. Especially if it's a near peer, somebody who has the same kind of power we do. So it's not something we should take lightly. It's not something we should encourage or want. And at the same time, America's weak. And I'm talking logistically weak. We rely on the people that we're pretending to saber rattle against more than you care to believe. So that pipeline of supplies gets shut off. What happens to American life? A lot of people don't think through these problems, but let me know what you guys think in the comments below. Definitely not something we want, and it's last ditch effort. And it seems like Washington is like the first thing. Hey, things are looking bad for us. Why don't we kill a couple soldiers overseas? Why don't we find a common enemy? That's what it seems like to me. And all else fails, they take you to war. All right, I'll see you all in the next one. Peace.